Hi everybody, this is Noelle from Petitti Garden Centers, and we are doing a spotlight on perennial ferns, how to grow, how to take care of, how to manage them. Now, these are not your tropical fern species. We're not talking about Boston ferns that you grow hanging from your porch during the summertime, or any of the indoor houseplant types. These are your true hardy perennial types. And I'll talk about their attributes in a little bit, but these ferns, once you get them established, they will be with you for the long run. So ferns are one of our longest lived plants out in the garden, so that's great. What do you need to know about growing perennial ferns? Well, first off, we always start with their light requirements. So for sunlight, what's great about the fern family is that they typically like the part sun to full shade aspect, and I should say part shade and part sun we use interchangeably. So let's just say part shade, because they're always going to want to be in shade, to full shade, okay? That's actually 6 or less hours of direct sunlight in the area. Now, if you look up ferns online or what have you, it'll say dappled shade lovers. So if you're getting an area that's always got some shade in the area, you get a little bit of light through that area as well. That is great too, okay? Some of these ferns, just so you know, can take more sun, but we're going to talk about that in a little bit, where they need a little bit more moisture to do that. So we'll talk about that. So as far as sun is concerned, part shade to full shade, no problem whatsoever, okay? For soil, ferns really prefer a well-drained, moist soil. I know it sounds like an oxymoron, but really what you're looking for is well-amended, humusy soil that will hold on to moisture, but then will let it go for those ferns. So well-drained, moist, evenly moist, consistent moisture in the soil, okay? And then of course, amending it. So any organic matter that you have, compost, planting mixes, whatever you want to add to make sure that that soil is well drained, yet holding on to moisture for them. Here's another thing that I don't think a lot of people know, but they like acidic soil too. Every one of these ferns can appreciate some acidity. Most of them can take very strong acidity, so that's good to know. Some of them can actually take alkaline soils or tolerate alkaline soils, so that's interesting as well. So just be aware, they're very adaptable to different soil types. But that consistent soil moisture and the drainage are very, very key for these ferns to do well. Okay, now watering. We just mentioned that consistent soil moisture. So again, it's like every other perennial plant that we are planting out in our gardens. 1 inch of water, 1 time per week, a slow, deep, thorough watering is what we're expecting. If you're going through a drought season, guess what? Your ferns will dry out, okay? They will shrivel. They'll usually be fine. They'll usually come back for you, but you gotta watch out for something like that, those really, really dry drought conditions. So you wanna make sure that you're watering them again thoroughly, 1 time per week. That's all you need. And if you get 1 inch of rainfall, it doesn't matter. You're ready to go. Those ferns will be happy and taken care of. Okay, now, when we talk about kind of maintaining ferns, yes, they can get dry. And as soon as you see dry tip or dry spots on the foliage, guess what? They're probably too dry and they do need some water. But here's the thing about ferns is that you can trim them, prune them, remove the 3 Ds, so the dead, diseased, dried areas without a problem. Will they produce more? Sometimes, if you have enough time in the growing season, they will produce more fiddleheads for you, but sometimes not. And that's okay, because typically their root base, their rhizomes, what they're growing from will produce all new for you the next growing season, okay? So never be afraid to remove the 3 Ds. That's always really important, and it's really important on all of the plants. As soon as you see that dead, diseased, dried up area, remove it, okay? And that'll really help. That'll be very beneficial to the plants starting to grow and push out new growth for you as well, okay? As far as propagation is concerned, you can split ferns. And I think it's easier to do this in the springtime where you're clearing everything away. You can actually cut back all of the foliage and go down and concentrate on that clump. You can dig the entire clump, lift it out, and then you can actually split the rhizome. Some of them can be very, very woody, so you might need a really sharp spade or shovel to do that, even a sharp knife to do it, okay? So just be aware of that. But they do very, very well if you split them in the spring. And it's nice because we often talk about ferns being a wonderful complement to very bold foliage hosta or coral bells, and of course you can split those at the same time of year. So you can do all of that propagation right at that time. Now here's another way to look at your ferns too and propagate ferns is through their spores. So when you look at ferns, and I'll show you here in a little bit, but I've got a little wasp by me, so I'm not going to use my hands too much. But when you look at ferns, you look underneath their foliage and they're producing little sori that have all these different spores inside of them. That's one way that we identify ferns is through their sori. They have different shapes. Some of them are rounded, some of them are moon shaped, some of them are kidney shaped, some of them are long. And so that's kind of how we go through and identify ferns quite often. But of course, that's holding all of their spores. So you might have a nice colony of ferns growing right underneath your mature fern, not even knowing it. Or you can actually collect those spores and try growing them from their spore seed, if you will, and then you can produce more ferns as well. So both work very, very nicely. Obviously, you get a nice mature division if you're going in there and dividing that clump and of course moving it to a different area. So just think about it. It takes a little bit longer to get those spores to really fill out and become nice and mature for you out there. Okay, so as far as attributes are concerned, ferns are fabulous as far as being deer and bunny resistant out there in the garden, because we know in the shade and wooded areas where you're trying to really grow some beautiful plants out there, you know, hosta can be a problem. And I've had customers ask me, can I plant, you know, ferns around my favorite hosta, and will that prevent deer from coming through? Ultimately, not, okay? So just keep that in mind, that your ferns are always gonna do really, really nicely for you as far as the deer and the bunny resistance. Can they protect hosta? I hate to say it, I think the deer are smart enough that they're just gonna go and find the plant that they know they can chomp on, okay? So keep that in mind. They complement the coral bells, obviously the hosta, any of those bigger, larger, leafy type shade perennials. I think they do very, very well with our shade grasses. So our sedges, Hacknacloa grass, all of those types of grasses, they look beautiful. And it's because of the pleasing foliage of ferns that we find all different, again, colors and frond types. So some can be very lacy, some can be very feathery. Their habits can differ. Some can be very upright, some can be very mounded and sort of weeping at times. So do look at ferns, kind of like we talk about looking at hosta. Look at the different colors, the different leaflets, all those types of things to really pick your favorite. So that pleasing foliage is an awesome attribute as well. Ferns, again, I mentioned, can be very adaptable to soils, just as long, again, you're providing them shade. So excellent shade tolerance, of course, but can be very, very adaptable to soils. So that's another attribute to them. And I'm gonna tell you, they're one of the best plants to grow with spring bulbs planted among them, because typically in the early spring when those bulbs come out, your ferns are just starting to develop, and those spring bulbs will bloom and then of course yellow and die back, and your ferns will start to unravel and unfurl and of course cover all of that yellow foliage. So it's a really nice plant to have planted nearby so they can cover all of that spring bulb foliage for you, okay? So that's always a good attribute to have with ferns. Okay, let's talk about families now. Now, there are hundreds of perennial fern families, and there are many great types that grow in Ohio. Some are native types of ferns, some are non-native, so I'm gonna point that out to you as well. The first family, and I'm just gonna start with the alphabet. So the first family that we have here today that we can show you is gonna be the Athyrium family, okay? Athyrium family includes the lady ferns, includes Japanese painted ferns, which you might be familiar with because they're pretty darn popular, and also a different type of fern called a Polystichum fern, okay? So we're gonna look at those. So the first one that I have here is I have two Japanese painted ferns, okay? The shorter one is the classic Japanese painted fern, it's the species, and you can tell these ferns are very, very different, but it's a varietal difference. You have a species here and you have a cultivated variety in my other hand called Ghost, okay? I'm gonna hold on to the species real quick, and what we love Japanese painted ferns for is that coloration, the frond coloration. So you've got very dark purple stems typically on the fronds, plus you have this lovely light to sagey grayish green coloration on the foliage. It's just really gorgeous. It's very, very different from, you look at a fern sometimes and you think, well, it's a green fern, but this has definitely got a lot of color, a lot of difference between some of your just green fronded types. Japanese painted fern is not a big fern. It will grow maybe to 12 inches tall, maybe to 18 inches wide. I have a Japanese painted fern in my garden that gets a little bit of sun, maybe 3 to 4 hours. I will tell you that it has not gotten more than 10 inches tall and 10 inches wide, and it's been in there for probably close to 10 years. So they may or may not grow depending on the root competition that it's planted around, and it is planted under a spruce tree. So that may be part of the issue there with it expanding. But they really do just a wonderful job of having kind of a weeping habit, low and mounded, really, really beautiful foliage. This one is the cultivated variety of Ghost. And as I mentioned, Ghost is a common Japanese painted fern. It has a much lighter green foliage color to it. It does have spore growth on it, so you see some brown spots here on the foliage here and there. Ghost, I have found, can change depending on light levels in the shade. So it really, really lightens up if it's got more sun, more dappled sun or what have you, more part shade, and it will kind of darken in fuller shade. So it does kind of depend. You do get that beautiful silvery cast. You do get the dark kind of purpley stems in the fronds, but I'll tell you, it is definitely more upright, obviously. So this one's going to be closer to about 2 foot tall and wide in the garden, maybe almost to 3 when it gets fully mature, but really, really beautiful coloration again, and sort of habit with these Japanese painted ferns. The other part of this family, the Athyrium family, is the lady fern, as I mentioned. Lady fern are very, very common. They are native to Ohio, okay? They grow very well, very easy to grow. These ferns are very easy to grow. Lady ferns especially, very vigorous. And again, more of a creeping type fern, just like the Japanese painted fern. They do have rhizomes under the soil. They sort of creep, but they stay in a mound, if you will. They don't really separate or anything like that. And you notice upright habit again with lady fern, probably up to about 2 foot tall, 2 foot wide. And this one's called Lady in Red. And we appreciate it because of those deep, dark red stems that are in the middle of that fern frond. Very pretty, lacy foliage, obviously, and that's with any of your lady ferns. You'll find that nice, deep or medium green on these ferns. And again, there are plenty, I'm finding them, plenty of your spores on the back, or the sori that contain those spores. So that's very cool. The other lady fern that I have is called Victorian lady. And this one is really, really what we call pinnate. It is like compound pinnate. If you look really closely at this foliage, and Taylor will come real close, it's got the laciest leaves to it, and they kind of have a forked end on them. They're really, really unusual, very pretty. This is a smaller fern, again, a little bit smaller than Lady in Red, maybe up to 2 foot tall, maybe 1.5 feet wide when it does get fully mature, but again, very, very frilly and lacy. So that's a great one to have as well. The outlier of this family, and it just got moved into kind of a different fern family, is the spleenwort. Okay, lovely common name, but spleenwort is also called like slender fern. This one's also known as glade fern. And you can tell, look at how tall and slender these fronds are. They're really, really beautiful, have a very unique sori on the back of them. It's almost like diagonal lines, arrows on their leaflets. So they're very, very different. This is a newer fern that we just brought in, but again, it has that kind of clumping to creeping rhizome with this one. So very unique types of ferns here. And like I said, lady fern, you really would only want to put them in the most part shade. Don't put them into sunny areas. They will completely dry out on you. But that in part shade, they need to have consistent moisture. Okay, so just be aware of that. And they're also the ones that they can take a little bit of alkaline soil if your soil tends to go that way above neutral. So that's something to consider as well. The second type that we have here are wood ferns, okay? Wood ferns are also known as Dryopteris. And so the Dryopteris ferns are very hardy, evergreen type ferns, okay? This is a wood fern. It's actually really, really cool, very, very woody stems, very upright plant here, and very lacy, very, very gorgeous. But you'll see how they winter over, and you have these beautiful fronds lasting way into late November and into December. And sometimes when they're not covered by snow, you'll have them standing up in the garden. So it's a nice fern to really put out there in, again, a shady spot. They can take a wide variety of soil ranges. Again, the wood ferns can, and I think it's just because of that evergreen hardiness. They're really able to tolerate very, very strong acidity and can move into the alkaline soil as well. But they really just like it slightly acidic, like most plants do, okay? Even moisture is fine. They can take a little bit of drought. I don't want you to have them go completely dry, but the wood ferns can take a little bit of drought. And we have another evergreen fern that I'm going to show you that can take drought too. So again, having that evergreen hardiness, being able to retain its foliage helps with how well they can tolerate maybe unique situations out in the garden. Don't expose this again to full sun. It will dry out very, very quickly. It will not do well, but part shade is okay with these guys. Again, make sure you keep them moist, okay? So that is a wood fern, a typical wood fern. This one, and this one's native, okay? But this one that I'm going to show you, this one's called Brilliance, and this is an autumn fern. And you're saying, wow, there's a difference in coloration on these ferns. There sure is, but I'm going to tell you that Brilliance fern is known for when that new growth comes out, it has sort of a pinky, coppery, orangey tone to it. and it is lovely when that new growth is formed. We've got all mature growth right now with a lot, you can even see them, right? They're so dark, a lot of sori on the back. And these ferns do tend to have more of that kind of limey, lighter green color. Really, really beautiful contrast compared to some of the dark colored wood fern. Again, this one is not a native. This is actually a Japanese variety, Asian variety, if you will, but upright. And I'm gonna tell you with the wood ferns, they're gonna be pretty substantial out there in the landscape. So we're talking 2 to 3 foot tall and wide typically, and their base is usually very, very clumping. Sorry, we have some really dry fronds down here right now because we've been dry this summer, but they produce these really woody clumps at the base. So like I mentioned, when you're dividing, you're gonna find that. Don't be afraid to cut into that clump, if you will, to get your divisions. It'll work just fine, no problem, okay? Next fern here is actually the ostrich fern. And I have sort of smaller, younger versions of this because I have seen ostrich fern grow 5 and 6 foot tall, okay? When they're young, you might see a 2 foot frond come out of this plant like this one. They can be medium green to like a lighter green color, and ostrich fern do take a lot of abuse out there in the garden. It still only wants you to expose them to about a part shade condition, keep them evenly moist. They can take a little bit of alkaline soil. Again, they can take a lot of stronger acidic soils. They do really, really well for us. If you're looking for a fern that has a really strong upright presence, maybe as a backdrop in the shade garden, this is the one for you because they really have a very, very particular presence out there in the garden. They look wonderful out there and stand very regally, very upright, if you will, okay? This is Matteuchia, and they just do a great job for us out in the shade garden, okay? Next one that I have down the line here, this is actually our cinnamon fern, and this is in the Osmunda family. And the cinnamon fern, this is a very young one because we can pick cinnamon fern out of a fern lineup typically because they produce those kind of cinnamony brown fronds that stick up in the middle. And those are their fertile fronds that produce all the sori, whereas all of these green fronds on the outside are sterile. There are no spores on the back of these fronds. So it's a beautiful green foliage plant. It is a hardy native plant, no problem whatsoever. But when they get more mature, that's where you're going to see those middle woody brown cinnamony looking fronds stick up, okay? So this is a nice one. 2 by 2 typically, maybe a little bit larger, but they work really, really well in, again, that part shade to full shade, moist soils. Now, I'm gonna tell you, cinnamon fern's really the only one I would do this with. If you want fern and you want it out in a sunny area, this plant can take it, okay? But it has to be consistently moist throughout the growing season. You can't let it go dry or it'll just fizzle up, it'll burn out. But the cinnamon fern is the one fern I would say, yeah, you can put it in full sun if you have wetter conditions. So maybe if you have an area that you're trying to grow like a rain garden, where the wetter parts of the rain garden, you can stick the cinnamon fern in. Yeah, it could definitely grow with your hardy hibiscus and other rain garden plants because as long as it's staying wet, it's gonna do fine for you, okay? Another great plant is, and I should say native fern, is our Christmas fern, okay? Christmas fern are in the Polystichum family, and Polystichum has quite a few that are in this family. What's unusual about the Christmas fern is it has broad, very broad foliage that doesn't produce any spores or any sori, and it has very thin foliage that does produce the spores. And you can see it, it's very dark on the back side, almost fuzzy looking on the back. And this is one of those thinner fronds. And so you can see all of that dark spore. And of course, sorry, a little bit of a woody stem. So I ended up breaking that one a little bit. But the thicker foliage doesn't have anything on it. So it's a very unique looking fern. They are a clump former. I should have mentioned the ostrich fern is a clump former as well. So is the cinnamon fern. So the Christmas fern, and they're very, very hairy. So you're going to see a lot of scales on the Christmas fern fronds as well. These are great hardy plants. The Polystichum family are evergreens, so they're like the wood ferns. They just have that built-in hardiness. Evergreen foliage, very tough over the winter months, will do very, very nicely. May be covered by snow, but can pop back up, no problem whatsoever, and just do a nice job for us. Maybe 2 to 3 foot when you get a nice mature clump growing, and they're just really, really beautiful, dark, deep green color to medium. So really unique kind of fern. I think it's so cool that they have 2 different types of fronds kind of intermingled that produce that way. So really, really nice. Now, this other Polystichum fern or shield fern, I should have mentioned that. So the shield fern family, the Polystichum family, this is called a tassel fern, okay? And this is an Asian fern, and sometimes they call it Korean tassel fern, Korean rock tassel, lots of different common names. This fern looks very different from your Christmas fern, but in the same family. Obviously very, very dense foliage, really pretty, kind of has some sharp toothy edges on it, which is good, again, for keeping the deer and the bunnies away, no problem there. But when you come really close to this fern, Taylor, if you look how hairy these stems are, there's a ton of hairy scales on here. And so that's kind of how you find them. The Polystichum family does have a lot of scaliness on their fronds. And what's neat about this fern is when they unravel, so they start as a fiddlehead and they grow up and they unravel backwards. And then at the tips of their fronds, they have this little, well, this one's kind of fuzzy still. They have this little tassel at the end. So it's the leftover fiddlehead that opens up and opens backwards and then just hangs off of the back of their frond, or off of the tip of their frond, I guess I should say. So it's that fuzzy little piece of the fiddlehead just left over. So that's how it gets its name, as tassel fern, obviously. Great low-growing fern, maybe 1.5 feet tall and wide. I really never see them get much bigger than that. Very glossy, again, evergreen because they're in the Polystichum family, but really, really nice. So out of all these ferns, and there's so many more, folks, but that's what we have to show you today. I'm just going to remind you that when you want to be successful with ferns, make sure that they are in part sun. I said it again. So I'm going to say part shade to full shade, because I didn't even really want to mention the sun when I'm talking ferns. So part shade to full shade, deep shade. Many of them will do fine in deep, deep, deep shade, okay? No problem whatsoever. Consistently moist but well-drained soil, typically acidic, which we usually are around here in Northeast Ohio, but some of them can go a little bit more alkaline and tolerate an alkaline soil pH. With fertilizer, oh my gosh, I forgot fertilizer, Taylor, I can't believe it. So really, they're very light feeders, so that's kind of why I forgot about it. But you don't need to feed your ferns heavily by any means. They're very, very light feeders. If you're providing them with compost, let's say every year in the fall, you give them a couple inches of compost around the ferns, that's really good. In the spring, if you want to fertilize them with a slow release, like Hollytone, so we're going to have Taylor flash it. Hollytone's really good for them. Feed them in the spring. That one time, if they're looking a little peaked by summer, you could feed them again in summer. It's really not necessary. Okay, so ferns don't need to be fertilized like our other perennials do. They're not flowering. So that's part of the reason why we have to fertilize some of these other perennials regularly to kind of maintain that flower, vigorousness, but we don't have to worry about that with ferns. So don't have to worry about the fertilizer or nutrient load as much with them. They're very tolerant of a lot of different conditions, but of course, moist is always going to be great, shady is always going to be great, and you'll have success with your ferns. Enjoy.